When the train from Melbourne to Sydney arrives at the border town of Albury, it only stops at the station for a few minutes to allow people to get on and off. But the stop at Albury station was not always so quick. At the end of the 19th century, this rail journey was made far more difficult because at that time 6 independent colonies occupied the Australian continent and the nation of Australia did not exist. Each of the 6 colonies had its own government and its own traditions and character, and crossing a border between the colonies then was the same as crossing an international border today. Customs officers checked your bags, and sometimes travellers had to pay import duty on items as unassuming as an umbrella. Yet the people of Australia shared a common heritage, and while there was pride in being a Queenslander or a Victorian, they also felt that they were all Australians, and having borders between them seemed to be more trouble than it was worth.
If we'd been here at the end of the 19th century, there would have been a border crossing right here, in front of the Waggunya Customs House that still stands in northern Victoria. This would have been just one of the many small customs posts that would have controlled bridges such as this across the Murray River, the dividing line between the colony of Victoria and the colony of New South Wales. To abolish borders in places like this, however, meant that Australia had to become a federated nation. In other words, these 6 independent colonies had to join together to become one country. And while it seems fairly obvious to us today that Australia should come together like this, at the time it was seen as a miracle that it happened at all. Federation did not just occur overnight, but was the product of many years of Australian history that gave rise to a particular constitution that governs a federation that is not repeated anywhere else in the world. We are going to look at how this system of government came about, and to do this we will look at our history, and from the very first European settlement on Sydney Cove we will follow the path that leads to the Federation of Australia. Along the way we'll see why, on January the 1st, 1901, the people of each colony made a brave choice that no longer would they be a citizen of, say, New South Wales, but a citizen of Australia.
The east coast of Australia was charted for the first time in 1770 by the British captain James Cook. 18 years later, the British claim to this vast tract of land was secured by the arrival of the First Fleet, a group of 11 ships under the command of Governor Arthur Phillip.
The British plan to establish a colony in Australia was ambitious to say the least. By the time the First Fleet had arrived here, it had been sailing for 8 months, and never before had the establishment of such a remote colony been attempted. On the 26th of January 1788, the fleet moored in the deep waters of what would come to be known as Sydney Cove. Here in the bush, beside a small freshwater creek, the colonists raised the Union Jack, and without any reference to the ancient and original inhabitants of this land, the entire east coast of Australia was claimed as a British possession. As the first trees were cut down and the first tents erected, the British colonisation of the continent had begun, and from this moment, Australia came under the laws, traditions and government of a country on the other side of the world.
In its early days, Sydney was no more than a large and very remote prison, and Governor Phillip had absolute power over most day-to-day activities in the colony. In return, it was Phillip's responsibility to ensure the survival of the colony and its 1,300 inhabitants, both convict and free. One of his main concerns was just feeding this small population, as British attempts to grow crops near the settlement of Sydney had failed. This made the colonists search for better farming land to the west, and at the most promising site they established a settlement, first called Rose Hill, but soon known as Parramatta, a mispronunciation of its Aboriginal name, meaning the meeting place of eels.
Just a few months after the landing of the First Fleet, Governor Phillip ordered that a small fort be built at this spot in Parramatta. This fort, really just a stone-built room, overlooks the head of the Parramatta River that eventually flows into Sydney Harbour, about 25 kilometres away.
The fort was built to protect a patch of ground known as the Crescent, where the very first farms in the district were established in May 1789. At first these farms were unsuccessful, until a few months later Governor Phillip gave permission for an ex-convict named James Roos to clear and farm a small block of land in eastern Parramatta. In an area known as Experiment Farm, James Roos got to work. He dug, by hand, ash and rotting straw into the soil, and through back-breaking work was able to produce the first proper harvest in the colony. As Roos had shown that European crops could grow in Australia, Phillip extended the size of his farm and awarded him Land Grant No. 1, making James Roos, an ex-convict who had served his 7-year sentence, the first person to privately hold land in Australia.
Phillip's policy of giving land to James Roos, that would have included this area here, shows him to be a shrewd realist. As Phillip was in charge of a penal settlement, he believed that if the colony was to develop, then it had to include the efforts of ex-convicts, many of whom, after all, were not hardened criminals, but found themselves in New South Wales due to poverty rather than habitual crime. Everyone who shared this belief came to be known as an emancipist, and while most emancipists were ex-convicts and their Australian-born children, the term is also applied to people such as Phillip, who believed that convicts could be rehabilitated and become valued members of their society.
Not all colonists in New South Wales agreed with Phillip's liberal attitude to the convicts. One such person was John MacArthur, who had arrived in the colony in 1790 as an officer of a military regiment called the New South Wales Corps, a group of soldiers whose task was to defend the colony. MacArthur soon found that his position gave him powers way beyond what he could have had back in Britain. His golden opportunity came in December 1792, when Governor Phillip left the colony, and the next governor didn't arrive from Britain for another 3 years. During this time, the officer in charge of the New South Wales Corps was made acting governor, giving these relatively junior military officers control of the colony. This opened up great opportunities for men like MacArthur and his fellow officers, and they quickly set about enriching themselves as best they could. Very quickly, the Corps stopped being just a military regiment, and it became instead a privileged club whose members dominated the economy of New South Wales. As this economy relied on the trade of rum rather than coinage for business, these military officers soon came to be known around the streets of Sydney as the Rum Corps.
John MacArthur's rise to political power began soon after the departure of Governor Phillip, when he received a grant of 50 acres at Parramatta in 1793, naming the property Elizabeth Farm after his wife. Here the MacArthurs built this simple but comfortable home that still survives as Australia's oldest house. In the fields that stretched away from here, down to the Parramatta River, MacArthur used the first plough in the colony, and by 1795 this holding had grown to be 500 acres, and the MacArthurs lived in a grand style. MacArthur and his companions came to be referred to as exclusives because of their superior attitude towards the convict population. And although they did not have any royal blood, the exclusives soon came to resemble a colonial aristocracy who believed that only they, and not the appointed governor, could run the colony.
This attitude was helped over the next 10 years by a succession of weak governors who quickly gave up trying to break the exclusives' hold on the economy of New South Wales. During this time, the exclusives grew accustomed to their privileged position, and they became very wealthy from the cheap convict labour on offer. And even though the large farms owned by the exclusives were developed through the efforts of convicts, the exclusives saw themselves as free settlers who deserved the rewards, while the convicts and their children were to be denied any meaningful rights. The exclusives' dream was for New South Wales to continue in this fashion, and they wanted to see a society with large numbers of slave-like convicts, all controlled by the Rum Corps, and a few wealthy families. This dream, however, started to turn sour with the arrival in 1806 of Governor William Bligh, the first strong leader in the post since Phillip. Bligh aimed to reassert the power of the British government, and he attacked the very heart of the exclusives' hold on the colony, the rum trade and the supply of convict labour. Accustomed to being in charge, the exclusives were ready for a fight, and on the 26th of January 1808, exactly 20 years after Phillip's landing at Sydney Cove, the commander of the Rum Corps gathered some men together and marched towards Government House. Australia's first and only military coup was about to take place.
The Corps would have come down from George Street and crossed a bridge over a small creek called the Tank Stream that would have been at the bottom here, before marching up the hill to a two-storey building that once stood at this site. This house, that had gardens going right down to Sydney Cove, was the home of all the early governors and is known as First Government House, because the governor, in theory at least, was the government. In 1808, this theory was about to be put to the test, as the Corps were on their way here to arrest Governor Bligh in what amounted to a mutiny that we now call the Rum Rebellion. Although Bligh had angered men such as MacArthur, there was still no excuse for arresting the governor, and it is clear that the officers of the Corps were moving against the legitimate government to protect their privileged way of life. According to the Corps' report, Governor Bligh was found hiding under a bed on the second floor of Government House. But whether this is true or not, he was first thrown into jail and later put on a ship bound for the new settlement of Hobart in Tasmania. No one was ever punished for this mutiny, but the Rum Rebellion was to bring the de facto rule of the New South Wales Corps to an end.
The situation in New South Wales was now desperate. Even the government in far-off Britain realised that something had to be done to regain its control and stop the colony coming apart at the seams. a new governor was needed. Luckily for New South Wales, they chose Lachlan Macquarie. Arriving in Australia on January 1st, 1810, Macquarie had sweeping powers to institute a one-man rule where the governor was answerable to the British Parliament alone. To strengthen his power, Macquarie also brought a new regiment of soldiers with him, and the New South Wales Corps was disbanded. Although many of its members, such as MacArthur, chose to stay in the colony, where their wealth continued to give them a lot of influence. The exclusives became strident opponents of Macquarie, and this opposition intensified when he revived the emancipist policy of Phillip and began to include ex-convicts in his administration. This enabled the emancipists to emerge from under the harsh control of the exclusives, and they were given positions of responsibility that enabled them to contribute to the colony's growth. Some of these emancipists, such as Francis Greenway, an ex-convict who designed the beautifully proportioned Hyde Park Barracks in Sydney, have left lasting testimonies to the wisdom of Macquarie's policy. Macquarie felt he faced an enormous task to bring the colony up to scratch, and his policy was definitely crash or crash through. He had to create the first bank, the Bank of New South Wales, construct over 500 kilometres of new roads, build lighthouses, schools, and improve relations with the Aborigines, which had been totally neglected during the rule of the exclusives. There were other schemes as well, such as the foundation of the town of Windsor on the outskirts of Sydney, built not as a place for convicts, but as a town for free settlers, with space reserved for a school, churches, and a courthouse. However, Macquarie's attitude and policies continued to anger many of the exclusives, and loud criticism broke out when he appointed ex-convicts to act as magistrates in the colony's courts. A flood of indignant letters bombarded the lawmakers in London, who began to think that Macquarie had forgotten that he was actually just a warden of a very large prison. In a decision based largely on inaccurate reports, Macquarie was recalled to Britain in 1821, and New South Wales lost a very capable governor. Of the many achievements from the period of Macquarie, one of the more important was the crossing of the Blue Mountains that lie to the west of Sydney. These mountains had kept European settlement confined to the coast, until in 1813 a way across them was finally mapped by Blaxland, Lawson and Wentworth, along with 4 convicts and several Aboriginal guides whose names are unknown. Within days of the crossing, plans were put in place to build a road to follow the explorers' footsteps.
The task of completing the road was given to William Cox, who, along with a team of 30 convicts, took 6 months to complete the job. This is a remarkable achievement, given that it consisted of over 160 kilometres of road, all cut through the rugged bush, as well as drains like this here, that were used to carry water away from the road. For their efforts, Macquarie pardoned all the convicts when their job was done. The most dangerous part of the road was this section here, the steep drop from Mount York down to the plains to the west. On the way down, logs had to be anchored to carriages to stop them getting out of control, and the way up was a long, exhausting walk for all concerned. In 1815, when Cox's Road was complete, Macquarie himself crossed the Blue Mountains, and you can still see the marks in the rock here where this overhang had to be chipped away to allow Macquarie's carriage to pass to the western plains, where the real wealth of the colony lay. Tragically, Macquarie was to die soon after leaving Sydney. But if you visit his tombstone in Scotland, it calls him the Father of Australia. A lofty title, but perhaps one he has earned. Not only was he the first to officially call this continent Australia, but we owe him a huge debt, because when he arrived here, he found a penal settlement barely surviving and was able to leave it a young nation in the making.
Having participated in the Macquarie administration, emancipists now began to seek political rights and representation in the government of New South Wales. As this campaign developed, it became the first stirring of European democracy in Australia. Leadership of this campaign came to rest with William Charles Wentworth, a man who had been born in New South Wales in 1790, 2 years after the arrival of the First Fleet. He was also one of those who had crossed the Blue Mountains in 1813, and the son of a wealthy and well-known family. But since his father had once been acquitted in court on a charge of highway robbery, the convict stain had attached itself, and Wentworth would spend most of his life fighting for the rights of ex-convicts and their Australian-born children. After completing a law degree in Britain, Wentworth returned to New South Wales in 1824 with a printing press, and he started a newspaper, The Australian, the first pro-emancipist journal that gave a voice to this strata of colonial society. In his newspaper, Wentworth argued strongly for the establishment of an elected parliament in New South Wales, so that all its citizens, emancipist and exclusive, would hold a stake, instead of all power being in the hands of the governor. These reforms, however, were slow in coming, as it took the British government some time to realise that the emancipists were not just an inferior social class, but people of British blood with a cause.
In 1823, a British Act of Parliament created a Legislative Council in New South Wales to assist the governor in his administration of the colony. And although this council was tiny and all its members appointed by the governor himself, at least the governor no longer ruled absolutely alone. 5 years later, in 1828, the size of this council was increased to 15, but each member was still appointed by the governor, and so the colony was no closer to true representative government. Wentworth's campaign to limit the powers of the governor became more and more public. Through his newspaper, he hounded any governor he felt was being unfair to emancipists, and he made his dislike of some governors public knowledge. In a notable instance, when one such governor, Ralph Darling, departed the colony in 1831, Wentworth opened the grounds of his house here in Vaucluse, Sydney, and 4,000 people came to a banquet to celebrate. While the exclusives may have believed that the drinking and carrying on here was typical of the lower classes, it clearly shows Wentworth as a powerful emancipist leader.
It was not until 1842 that the Legislative Council was expanded to 36 members, 24 of whom were for the first time elected. Largely due to Wentworth's efforts, this council could propose laws and contain members who were ex-convicts. The emancipists were at last gaining some rights in the colony. Wentworth became the leader of this new expanded council until 13 years later, and 34 years after the campaign had begun, Wentworth realised his dream, and a fully elected New South Wales Parliament was finally granted by the British government in 1855. Although only male citizens could vote and stand for office in this Parliament, all social classes could be involved, regardless of their wealth or background.
During the 67 years we've been looking at, government in New South Wales had evolved through three stages: the frontier anarchy of the New South Wales Corps, the firm one-man rule of the governor, and finally a parliament elected by all male citizens. While women in New South Wales had to wait until after Federation for the vote, this was still a great step forward in terms of Australian democracy. By the 1850s, many things had changed in Australia from the days of Phillip and Macquarie. In 1840, for example, the last ship of convicts bound for New South Wales arrived at Sydney, and slowly the colony moved from being a jail to a land of free settlers. Because of this, the political platform of Wentworth and the Emancipists fizzled out and other issues became more important. And not just here in New South Wales, as many areas of the Australian continent had now been settled by Europeans and separate colonies established. It is to these areas that we will now go to follow the pathway to federation.